On Easter Sunday, 1975, a trusted deacon walked into Mount Mercy Baptist Church with $22,000 in offering money and was never seen again. No goodbye, no body, just an empty sanctuary and a stain on his name that would last generations. But nearly 50 years later, his granddaughter returns to the crumbling church. And beneath the floorboards, she finds what the congregation was never meant to see: a hidden ledger, a secret room, and the truth that could finally clear her grandfather's name, or the church forever. Before you press play, make sure to subscribe. This is a story about silence, sacrifice, and the secrets buried beneath sacred ground. Mount Mercy Baptist Church, Easter Sunday, April the 13th, 1975, 9:07 p.m. The sanctuary was silent now. The pews, once filled with worshipers in pastel dresses and pressed suits, sat empty in the dimming light. Stained glass windows glowed faintly in the warm Alabama dusk, casting fractured colors across the red carpet like God's own fingerprint, fading by the minute. Deacon Isaiah Bell stood alone at the altar, sleeves rolled, collar loosened, his weathered hands sorting through the crisp bills and handwritten envelopes from that morning's Easter offering. 22,000 even. He counted twice. He always counted twice. A metal offering plate rested beside the stack, worn smooth by years of passing palms. The sanctuary still smelled faintly of lilies and sweat, of wax and old hymnals. Somewhere deep in the building, the radiator groaned. It was never quiet here, not really. Not even at night. Isaiah reached for his leather-bound church ledger, opened it to the April ledger sheet, and began to write. But he paused. His hand hovered above the page. Outside, someone was walking. Bootsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed on the gravel lot just beyond the sanctuary's rear door. He glanced up. The rest of the staff had left hours ago. Only the custodians and choir ladies stayed this late, but they never entered from the back. He listened again. Then, silence. Isaiah closed the ledger, slid it under the altar shelf, and straightened up. A deep, familiar unease crept into his chest, one he hadn't felt since the winter meeting in February. Since the whispers about funds, about misuse, about something happening in the basement no one dared name. He turned, slowly, and walked toward the rear of the church. He passed the baptismal font, now dry and cracked at the edges, and the old wooden pulpit where he had once preached in Reverend Lawson's absence. He paused near the rear hallway, where the air always turned cold, even in spring. The back door creaked open, and then, nothing. No scream, no struggle, no sign of Deacon Isaiah Bell ever again. Only the offering plate, still resting quietly on the altar, and a church ledger that would remain sealed in a drawer for nearly 50 years, untouched, unread, and unanswered. Until now. Mount Mercy Baptist Church, Easter Sunday, April the 13th, 1975, 9:07 p.m. The sanctuary was silent now. The pews, once filled with worshipers in pastel dresses and pressed suits, sat empty in the dimming light. Stained glass windows glowed faintly in the warm Alabama dusk, casting fractured colors across the red carpet like God's own fingerprint, fading by the minute. Deacon Isaiah Bell stood alone at the altar, sleeves rolled, collar loosened, his weathered hands sorting through the crisp bills and handwritten envelopes from that morning's Easter offering. 22,000 even. He counted twice. He always counted twice. A metal offering plate rested beside the stack, worn smooth by years of passing palms. The sanctuary still smelled faintly of lilies and sweat, of wax and old hymnals. Somewhere deep in the building, the radiator groaned. It was never quiet here, not really, not even at night. Isaiah reached for his leather-bound church ledger, opened it to the April ledger sheet, and began to write. But he paused. His hand hovered above the page. Outside, someone was walking. Bootsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed on the gravel lot just beyond the sanctuary's rear door. He glanced up. The rest of the staff had left hours ago. Only the custodians and choir ladies stayed this late, but they never entered from the back. He listened again. Then, silence. Isaiah closed the ledger, slid it under the altar shelf, and straightened up. A deep, familiar unease crept into his chest, one he hadn't felt since the winter meeting in February, since the whispers about funds, about misuse, about something happening in the basement no one dared name. He turned slowly and walked toward the rear of the church. He passed the baptismal font, now dry and cracked at the edges, and the old wooden pulpit, where he had once preached in Reverend Lawson's absence. He paused near the rear hallway, where the air always turned cold, even in spring. The back door creaked open. And then, nothing. No scream, no struggle, no sign of Deacon Isaiah Bell ever again. Only the offering plate, still resting quietly on the altar, and a church ledger that would remain sealed in a drawer for nearly 50 years, untouched, unread, and unanswered. Until now. Present day. Late autumn. Mount Mercy, Alabama. The hinges groaned like an old man clearing his throat. Naomi Bell paused just inside the church doorway, letting the light spill in behind her. Dust swirled in golden shafts across the sanctuary like rising incense, disturbed only by her breath and the creak of the warped floor beneath her boots. She hadn't stepped inside Mount Mercy Baptist Church since she was 12. Now 33, Naomi stood in the same aisle where her grandfather's name had once been whispered in reverence, and later in disgrace. Deacon Isaiah Bell. The man who'd carried the offering plate for 20 years without fail. The man who disappeared with all of it on Easter Sunday, 1975. At least that's what they said. 3 months, the realtor had told her. The demolition crew's on standby. We just need the family to clear out any remaining items. There wasn't much left. Just hollow pews, warped hymnals, and the scent of abandonment. But Naomi had agreed anyway. Out of guilt, maybe, or curiosity. She walked slowly down the center aisle, her fingers brushing each pew as she passed. The cushions were cracked. The hymn numbers on the wall still read 318/212/105, as if someone had frozen time in its place. At the altar she paused and looked down. There, resting in the same spot it had been for decades, sat the offering plate. Tarnished, dented, but unmistakably the same. Her hand hovered over it. Then, slowly, she picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. Not just with age or metal, but with memory. As a child, she used to help him carry it to the back office. He'd let her hold the corner of it like she was doing something important. His voice had always been warm then. Steady. A presence that made you feel safe just by standing beside him. But safety didn't last long. By the time she turned 13, his name had become a cautionary tale. "Don't be like Deacon Bell," they'd whisper. "He ran off with God's money. Shame on his house, shame on his blood." Naomi closed her eyes. Part of her hated herself for even coming back here. The other part, the one that had never fully buried the questions, urged her forward. She stepped behind the altar, knelt carefully, and pulled open the old drawers beneath the pulpit. Empty. Then she tapped on the wood paneling along the back wall. A hollow sound answered. Frowning, Naomi placed the offering plate aside and leaned closer. She ran her hands along the molding, fingers catching on a seam in the wood she didn't remember. The panel gave slightly. It wasn't locked. With a soft grunt, she pulled it open, revealing a narrow cavity behind the altar, no wider than her arm. Inside, a thin leather-bound book coated in decades of dust. A Bible. She pulled it out slowly. The edges were cracked, the pages warped, but there, inside the cover, written in the neat slanted penmanship she recognized from childhood thank-you cards, Deacon Isaiah Bell, Mount Mercy Baptist Church, Easter 1975. Naomi sat back on her heels. She hadn't expected to feel anything, but the wave that hit her now was sharp and strange. Grief, maybe, or guilt, or some unspoken longing she didn't know she still carried. She opened the Bible gently. Inside were sparse notes, thin underlines, and one marked passage in bold red ink. "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." John 8:32. She stared at the verse, heart beginning to pound. It didn't mean anything. Not yet. But her grandfather had marked it, purposefully, as if he knew someday someone would find it. Naomi looked back at the altar, at the offering plate, at the dust-covered pews and crooked light spilling through the stained glass. This church had swallowed the story of his disappearance for nearly half a century. But maybe, just maybe, it hadn't digested all of it. She stood up, the Bible pressed tight against her chest, and whispered aloud for the first time in years, "I don't think you ran, Granddad." The silence that answered felt different this time. Not empty, but waiting. The sun was beginning to fall behind the trees when Naomi climbed into the crawl space beneath the sanctuary. The church's underbelly smelled of mold and rust, a cold, earthy rot that made her gag. She pulled the collar of her sweatshirt over her mouth, holding the flashlight steady as she ducked under a low beam. Cobwebs clung to her face. Rusted nails jutted from splintered wood. Somewhere behind her, a possum skittered out of sight. I shouldn't be down here alone, she thought, but she'd already ignored that little voice hours ago. The contractor hadn't shown up. Some issue with a water line and a double-booked site. Typical. Naomi wasn't patient. She wanted this done. She needed to feel like she was doing something. Anything. The realtor had said to look for old church documents, anything historical the denomination might want to preserve before demolition. Naomi didn't care about that. She was looking for her grandfather. The truth of him, anyway. Her flashlight cut across beams and broken joists until something shiny caught the light. Metal, nestled between two joists just beneath the altar platform. Naomi squatted closer. Her boot slipped in the loose soil, and she nearly hit her head on the beam above. Swearing under her breath, she steadied herself and reached for it. An offering plate, just like the one on the altar, but older, thicker. This one was dented, partially corroded, and wedged awkwardly in the wood, as if someone had shoved it there in a hurry. She gripped it with both hands and pulled it free. As she did, something shifted behind it. Wood groaned, and a bundle of papers wrapped in plastic and bound with string slid out from the space between the floorboards, dirt-covered and damp, but still intact. Naomi froze. Her heart was suddenly pounding in her ears. She sat cross-legged in the dirt, pulled out the bundle, and wiped her hands on her jeans before undoing the twine. Inside was a small financial ledger, the kind the church used to track offerings. The leather cover was brittle with age, but the ink inside had barely faded. The dates at the top of the first page read, March-April 1975. She turned the pages carefully, her breath catching as she read through the entries. March 9th, $684.23. March 16th, $712.75. March 23rd, $805.11. March 30th, $848.06. April 6th, $925.90. April 13. Easter Sunday, $22,000 circled. Below that figure, a single line had been added in pencil. He took it. God forgive him. Naomi stared at the words. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the page. Most of the following pages had been torn out, the jagged remnants still attached to the spine, but one entry further back remained. There were names listed, 3 of them: Elder Samuel Lott, Elder Vernon Black, Elder Joseph Crane. Next to each name, dollar amounts, all in round numbers, thousands, no details, no dates, just ink and implication. She swallowed. These weren't offering totals. These were payments. Her flashlight flickered, casting jittery shadows across the beam above. Naomi exhaled and rubbed her thumb across the ink, half hoping it would smear and make the names vanish. It didn't. She placed the ledger carefully in her canvas bag, along with the old offering plate. Then she crawled backward toward the access hatch, her breath shallow in the chill air. She emerged into the sanctuary covered in dirt, the afternoon light now gold and low across the stained glass. She sat for a moment at the base of the altar, holding the book in her lap. Her grandfather hadn't disappeared because of greed. He was silenced, and someone in that church wanted it to stay that way. Naomi sat at the edge of the altar, her jeans streaked with dust and soil, the ledger still open in her lap. 3 names: Lottery Black, Crane. None of them sounded familiar. Not to her. But if they were church elders in 1975, they would have been men of status, well known in the community, and powerful enough to keep things buried, literally. She reached for her phone, opened the Notes app, and typed the names out. Then she added a new line. April 13th, 1975. $22,000 vanished, ledger hidden in crawl space. Name circled. Note: he took it. God forgive him. Next pages torn. 3 elders, 3 cash figures. She paused, heart racing. It wasn't just the hidden ledger. It was the intent behind it. Someone had hidden this record where they thought no one would ever look, under the altar, under the floor, beneath the weight of an entire church's shame. And maybe that was the plan all along. She closed the ledger and packed it back into her canvas bag with the metal offering plate, then glanced once more around the sanctuary. Afternoon light stretched long now through the stained glass. Red and blue streaks bled across the dusty pews. It reminded her of bruises. She needed answers. The town library was only 6 blocks away, a brick building tucked behind the courthouse, its parking lot cracked and weed-choked. Naomi hadn't been inside since middle school. The same faded "Quiet Please" sign hung crookedly on the door. Inside, the air smelled like yellowed paper and old wood polish. A middle-aged librarian looked up from behind the circulation desk. Her name tag read, Carolyn. Naomi approached slowly. "Hi. Sorry to bother you. I'm looking for some old church records, specifically Mount Mercy Baptist Church, anything from the 1970s, elder board lists, bulletins, newspaper clippings, that sort of thing." Carolyn squinted. "That's going back a ways. I know. My grandfather served there. Isaiah Bell." The woman's expression changed, not quite pity, but something close to discomfort. "I remember that name," she said quietly. "He disappeared." "So they say." Carolyn nodded, then gestured toward a corner stairwell. "Archives are in the basement. Microfilm, filing cabinets. The church minutes are spotty. They didn't send in copies regularly back then. But there's a 1975 Easter Sunday bulletin. You might get lucky." Naomi spent nearly 2 hours in the basement archive, her knees stiff from crouching, her fingers smudged with ink. She found it at last. A creased copy of the Easter Sunday program, April 13th, 1975. The front read, Mount Mercy Baptist Church Easter Service, 11 a.m. "He is risen." She flipped to the back. There, beneath the weekly announcements, was a list. Board of Elders. Elder Samuel Lott, Elder Vernon Black, Elder Joseph Crane, Deacon Isaiah Bell, Reverend Elijah Stovall. Naomi stared at the list. The names matched the ledger. The next page showed a black and white photo. A grainy snapshot of the elders standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the pulpit. Isaiah was there, third from the left, smiling faintly, suit pressed. The man beside him, tall, dark-framed glasses, a squint, was labeled Elder Lot. She took a photo of the page with her phone, then pulled up a search on the local county register. One by one, she typed in the names. Samuel Lot, deceased, 1988, Vernon Black, deceased, 1993, Joseph Crane, deceased, 2002, all three long dead. The timing meant no confrontation, no confession, but someone had preserved the ledger long enough to hide it. Someone had torn out the rest of the pages. Someone had circled that $22,000 line and written that message. He took it. God forgive him. Was that guilt? A warning? Or a cover-up? Naomi packed her things, thanked Carolyn upstairs, and headed out into the fading daylight. The sky was streaked pink now. The town felt smaller than she remembered, quieter, like it was holding its breath. She climbed into her car and stared for a moment at the photo on her phone. Her grandfather's face looked back at her from the church bulletin, caught forever in that moment, unaware that hours later he would vanish without a trace. Until now. The house sat on the edge of a gravel road, just past the tree line where the maples turned wild and overgrown. It was a modest one-story cottage, half swallowed by ivy, with a porch that sagged like an exhausted sigh. Wind chimes tapped softly in the breeze, and a rusted bird bath out front overflowed with pine needles and rainwater. Naomi parked along the shoulder and checked the note she'd scribbled from the library files. Geneva Thompson, choir director, 1959 to 1978. She was the last surviving member of the old Mount Mercy leadership. 90 years old, fading, but still here. She gathered the church bulletin and the old offering plate from the passenger seat, hesitating before walking up the steps. The porch creaked under her boots, and before she could knock, the screen door opened. A caretaker, young, early 20s, with tired eyes and a gentle face, looked at her through the mesh. "She's not doing too well today," the woman said. "Hard time remembering faces. Sometimes she confuses years." "I'm not family," Naomi said, "but I think she knew my grandfather, Isaiah Bell." The caretaker blinked. That name still carried weight. "Let me ask," she said, and disappeared inside. Naomi waited. A moment later, the caretaker returned and held the door open. "She says she remembers a bell. Said she sang at his wedding. Come in quiet." The living room smelled like rose water and old paper. Faded curtains let in a soft gray light, and the framed gospel album covers hung crooked on the wood-paneled walls. Naomi followed the caretaker into a room off the hallway where an elderly woman sat near a window, wrapped in a blue crocheted blanket. Her face was thin and papery, eyes cloudy but alert. She held a worn Bible in her lap, thumbing through it idly like muscle memory. "Miss Thompson," Naomi said gently. The old woman smiled. "Call me Geneva, everyone else does." Naomi stepped closer. "I'm Naomi Bell, Deacon Isaiah Bell's granddaughter." Geneva's hands paused on the Bible. Her smile faltered just slightly. "Isaiah," she said softly. "He had a laugh like honey in tea." Naomi sat beside her. "I'm trying to understand what happened to him." Geneva was quiet for a long time. The caretaker lingered in the doorway, uncertain. Naomi opened her bag and gently set the offering plate on the side table. "I found this under the church, along with a ledger, hidden. The last entry was Easter Sunday. Ayrte torlayrte erbeti aindu." Geneva's hand moved slowly toward the plate. Her fingertips brushed the edge like it might burn her. "He carried that every Sunday," she murmured. "Wouldn't let the boys touch it till they were grown." "Do you know why someone would hide it?" Naomi asked. "Do you remember anything strange that day?" Geneva's gaze drifted past her, toward something Naomi couldn't see. "There was a girl," she said at last. 16, sang in the youth choir. I remember because she had a voice that sounded like morning, and she came to me crying the week before Easter. What did she say? Geneva shook her head slowly. Said the elders wanted to pray over her, but not in the chapel, in the room behind the sacristy. Said she felt dirty afterward. Not touched, not that she said, but scared. Naomi felt a chill work its way down her spine. What did my grandfather do? Geneva's voice thinned to a whisper. He told Reverend Stovall they were twisting scripture for control. Said it was wickedness disguised as faith. Said if they didn't stop, he'd speak from the pulpit next Sunday. Naomi swallowed hard. But he never did. Geneva didn't answer. Instead, she reached slowly into her Bible and pulled out a brittle envelope. She placed it in Naomi's hands. He gave me this the night before Easter, she said. Told me not to open it unless something ever happened to him. I never did. Too afraid of what might be inside. Naomi opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was a typed letter on church stationery and a photograph. The letter was brief. If you're reading this, I've gone missing or worse. The Lord sees all. I tried to stop them, tried to call it out. I failed. The money's not the reason, that's what they'll say. But it isn't. Isaiah. The photograph was faded but clear enough. It showed the same sanctuary Naomi had walked through just yesterday, but the floorboards were torn up, revealing a hidden hatch beneath the altar. Her breath caught. She looked at Geneva, whose eyes were damp now, clouded not just by age, but by memory. What was that hatch? Naomi asked. Where did it lead? Geneva looked out the window and whispered, where they hid their sins. Naomi didn't sleep that night. She sat at the motel desk long after midnight, the motel's rusting AC groaning against the wall like an old beast in its final breath. The letter from Isaiah lay on the desk beside the offering plate and photograph, their presence heavier than anything she had packed in her suitcase. The hatch, the photo, the phrase, where they hid their sins. She couldn't shake Geneva's words, couldn't stop replaying them in her mind. By 7 a.m., she was parked outside Mount Mercy Baptist Church again, the sky low with fog, cicadas screaming from the trees like sirens. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Everything looked the same. Still, as if the air had gone stale, waiting for her return. She walked slowly toward the altar and stood over the exact spot captured in the photograph. The floorboards creaked under her feet. She knelt, brushed the dust away, and tapped. Hollow. She retrieved a screwdriver from her bag, wedged the edge beneath one of the planks, and pried upward. It took more effort than she'd expected. Someone had nailed them down tightly, but soon a board gave way with a dry crack. Then another, and another. After 10 minutes of work, she exposed what the photograph had promised, a rectangular hatch reinforced with iron brackets. She leaned closer. A brass ring was set into the wood. No lock, just weight and age. She braced herself and pulled. It took all her strength to open. The hatch creaked open on rusted hinges, revealing a dark void beneath the altar. A faint gust of air drifted up, damp and sour. Naomi grabbed her flashlight and shined it downward. A narrow stone staircase descended into an underground chamber, barely wide enough for one person. The stone walls wept with condensation. Mold bloomed at the corners, and at the bottom, just visible in the beam of her light, sat something large, round, and familiar. The old baptismal font. She recognized it from childhood photos, back when full immersion baptisms had been a monthly event, when her grandfather used to help lift the wet robes of new believers and wrap them in clean towels. But this was different. She took a breath and began to descend the stairs, the damp stones slick beneath her boots. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like even the air refused to stir down here. When she reached the bottom, she stepped carefully around the font. It was dry now, the inside stained with age, the surrounding tiles cracked. But something about it felt wrong. She circled slowly and spotted the hairline fracture along the base. She crouched and placed her hand against the crack. It wasn't just a crack. It was a seam. A false bottom. Naomi grabbed a crowbar from her bag and slid the tip into the gap. It resisted at first, then gave. She pried. The stone lid lifted with a moan of protest, and beneath it, sealed in layers of disintegrating fabric and plastic sheeting, was a metal lockbox, its hinges eaten by rust. She dragged it out, coughing from the mold and dust, and cracked it open. Inside were coins, old offering envelopes, a second offering plate, and a set of church keys wrapped in wax paper. She reached beneath them and found a rolled-up page torn from a larger ledger, the date smeared but still legible. April 10th, 1975. More names, more amounts, more initials, and at the bottom, in different handwriting, funds removed and relocated by instruction of Eld. J.C. Joseph Crane, she thought, one of the 3 from the Easter list. And beneath that, a second line, written hastily. Do not trust the prayer room. They do not pray there. Naomi felt her stomach turn. She shoved everything back into her canvas bag and climbed the stairs 2 at a time, heart pounding harder than the exertion required. When she reached the sanctuary floor again, the sun had broken through the fog, flooding the stained glass in harsh, fractured light. She stood alone, breathless, sweat clinging to her neck. This church was built to hide things, and somewhere beneath this floor, beyond that baptismal font, beyond the ledger, beyond the photograph, was a room someone wanted erased from memory. A room that hadn't been built to baptize, but to silence. Naomi didn't tell the realtor. Not yet. She drove to the nearest hardware store, bought a crowbar with a rubber grip, a pair of heavy-duty gloves, and a headlamp. The cashier gave her a curious glance when she added a dust mask and a roll of industrial garbage bags, but Naomi didn't offer an explanation. She drove back to Mount Mercy with the kind of cold determination that could only come from rage held at a simmer. She'd spent the morning combing the church blueprints. They were crude copies, folded into the back of a file box at the county office, stained with coffee rings and water damage. But the plans were clear enough. There was a sealed space behind the sacristy wall. No door, no ventilation, no reason for it to exist, unless someone didn't want it found. By noon, Naomi was in the sacristy, sleeves rolled up, sweat beading along her brow as she drove the crowbar into the paneling just above the floor. The wall gave easier than she expected. The plywood behind the plaster cracked like dry bones. Behind it, darkness. A narrow hallway, just wide enough for one person. The scent that drifted out was worse than rot. It was damp wood, mildew, old wax, and something sour, like sweat sealed in cloth for decades. She ducked inside. The beam from her headlamp cut through the pitch, revealing a small underground room, maybe 10 feet wide, with crumbling brick walls and a low, arched ceiling. The floor was concrete, cracked and stained. At the far end sat a wooden chair bolted to the ground, its legs warped from age. Leather straps dangled from the arms. Naomi froze. It wasn't a prayer room. It was a restraint room. To the right of the chair stood a rusted tin table with a melted candle stub still stuck to it. Burn marks marred the wood grain. The walls were blackened in places, scorched from years of use. And across the back wall, someone had scrawled in faded chalk, "Deliver us from evil." Her stomach turned. She stepped deeper into the room, fighting the rising nausea, and saw something else. A small wooden box nailed shut and half buried behind the chair. She pried it open. Inside were torn hymnals, a broken communion chalice, a white cloth collar, and, at the very bottom, a folded piece of paper wrapped in plastic. She peeled the plastic back slowly. The paper was brittle. The ink had bled. But she could still make out the writing. Her grandfather's. I told them this was not deliverance, that it was a lie, that it was abuse hiding behind scripture. They said I was soft, said I'd betrayed the circle. I told them I would not be part of this again, not after what they did to that girl. I will go to the pulpit Sunday. I will say their names. I will show the ledger. If this is the last thing I do, let God see it. Let him be my witness. Naomi's hands shook. She lowered herself onto the edge of the brick wall, her breath catching in her throat. For nearly 50 years, people had whispered that Isaiah Bell was a thief, a coward, a man who took the church's money and disappeared. But now she knew the truth. He had been preparing to expose something vile, and someone made sure he never got the chance. She stood slowly, scanning the walls once more. A thought flickered in her mind. If this room had been used for deliverance, if young girls were brought here under the guise of prayer, then the people who built it didn't just hide money. They hid sins in flesh and blood. She turned toward the exit, but paused. The leather straps on the chair were still intact, which meant someone had taken the time to preserve this space, even after the scandal faded, even after her grandfather vanished. This hadn't been forgotten. It had been protected, and the people who did that, some of them might still be alive. The rain began as Naomi pulled into the church parking lot the next morning. A soft, persistent drizzle that slicked the pavement and blurred the windshield. She sat in her car, engine idling, fingers clutched around the steering wheel. The box she'd found in the hidden room now sat on the passenger seat. She hadn't slept. Couldn't. Not after what she'd seen. Not after reading her grandfather's final warning. A man of faith preparing to bring darkness into the light, only to vanish before he could speak. But he hadn't been silenced entirely. He had left breadcrumbs, and if he'd hidden one message, maybe he'd hidden more. Naomi stepped back into the church, the old sanctuary bathed in gray light, the air damp from the storm pressing against the stained glass windows. She made her way through the main hall to the small office at the rear, once Isaiah Bell's study. The room hadn't been used in years. Dust covered everything. The desk, the bookcase, the cracked leather chair he used to sit in. She flicked on the desk lamp. The bulb buzzed. Faint light spilled over yellowed paper, scattered sermon notes, and boxes stacked against the far wall. She started going through them, page by page. Sermons from 1971, 1972, a full volume from 1974. Organized, careful. Her grandfather had been meticulous. But then, the 1977 volume was missing. She searched again. Nothing. She moved to the bookshelf, top shelf, third row, tucked behind a stack of Sunday school lesson plans. A black leather notebook, unmarked. She pulled it free. Her fingers tingled. The pages were filled in his handwriting, neat, slanted, strong. Not sermons, a journal. She sat in his old chair and began to read. March 12th, 1975. The meetings behind the sacristy continue. They say it's deliverance. I call it fear disguised as holiness. They lay hands on the youth, demand confessions, humiliate them in private. Reverend Stovall has gone blind to it, or maybe complicit. March 25th, 1975. One girl fainted during a session. Sister Geneva came to me in tears. The elders say she was unrepentant. That's why it took so long. I asked what sin a 16-year-old could commit to deserve this. They didn't answer. Just said she would understand when she's clean. April 2nd, 1975. Joseph Crane approached me with a warning. Said I was tearing apart the body of Christ. That if I didn't keep quiet, I'd face the same fate as Brother Marshall. But no one ever talks about Brother Marshall. He left in '68, didn't he? April 10th, 1975. The money is being moved. I've seen the records. Funds withdrawn for counseling ministries, but it's going straight into their pockets. And now they want me to sign off on another $10,000 for restoration sessions. I told them no. April 11th, 1975. There are voices in the church at night, not the choir, chanting, low, ritualistic. I stayed late last night and heard them through the sacristy wall. I think there's another room, one not in the blueprints. I need to find it before Sunday. April 12th, 1975. They know. Vernon came to my home. Said if I go to the pulpit, I'll end up under the foundation like the others. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. April 13th, 1975, Easter Sunday. If this is my last entry, let it be known. I did not run. I did not steal. I stood where others bowed. Let God bear witness. Naomi stared at the last page for a long time, the air in the room pressing in on her like a weight. He knew. They threatened him. They were laundering church money to fund psychological abuse disguised as spiritual healing. And when he refused to stay silent, they buried him. In reputation first, and maybe in body soon after. She gently closed the journal and stood. Her hands weren't just shaking. They were clenched. She didn't just want to uncover the truth anymore. She wanted justice. That night, she drove to the county police department and waited until Detective Sarah Miller, one of the only people still on staff from the era when the case was considered cold, finally came to speak with her. Naomi placed the journal on the desk between them. "You need to see this," she said. Detective Miller opened the first page, then another, then another. Her brow furrowed deeper with each entry. "We always heard rumors," the detective murmured. "But nothing stuck. The church stonewalled us. They had influence back then, connections. Even some of our own officers were members of Mount Mercy." She looked up. "Where exactly did you find this?" "In a sealed room under the sacristy," Naomi said. "It wasn't a prayer room. It was a holding room. There are candles, straps on the chair, scorch marks, and I found 2 different offering plates. The money trail wasn't just spiritual. It was financial. My grandfather was trying to expose it." Detective Miller sat back slowly. The weight of what Naomi was saying settled into the silence. "I'll need to see that room for myself," she said at last. "I'll take you tomorrow," Naomi replied. "And what do you want from all this?" the detective asked. Naomi looked at her, steady. "I want my grandfather's name back." The next morning, the church parking lot was marked by 2 cars, Naomi's silver sedan and the unmarked cruiser belonging to Detective Sarah Miller. Rain still clung to the ground from the night before, and a veil of fog curled low around the sanctuary steps as Naomi unlocked the front door. Detective Miller followed her inside, boots heavy on the old wood, eyes scanning every shadowed corner of the building with practiced calm. "This place feels like it remembers everything," the detective murmured. "It does," Naomi replied. "It's just never been asked." They moved in silence down the hallway, past the sacristy, and into the hidden passage Naomi had uncovered. The detective ducked through the broken paneling, stepping into the dark corridor Naomi had already lit with battery lanterns. When Miller reached the hidden chamber, her body froze in the doorway. The headlamp beam flicked across the restrained chair, the burned table, and the chalk-smeared words on the wall. "Deliver us from evil." She didn't speak right away. Then finally, "My God." Naomi stepped beside her, holding out the journal again. He wrote everything down, right up to the day he vanished. Miller took it, flipped through a few entries. Her jaw set tighter with each line. "I'll need to get a forensic team in here," she said. "Photograph, sample, document." "The works." Naomi nodded. "There's more." She knelt beside the floor tiles near the far wall and lifted the loose panel she had marked with chalk. Beneath it, the lockbox from the baptismal font, sealed now in a protective bag. "The original ledger," she said, "the financial records, and a key." "A key?" Naomi held it up. bronze, old, with the number 7 etched into its handle. "I've been through the church from top to bottom. There's no room 7 on the blueprint, but Geneva Thompson once told me there was a room they stopped using, a back room, something they shuttered after it all got too loud." Detective Miller took the key carefully, then stood. "We'll search for it. This changes everything." But the truth rarely lies quiet. That evening, as Naomi returned to her motel room, she found the door ajar. Her chest went tight. She stepped inside slowly and froze. The room had been torn apart, papers scattered, desk drawers open. The Bible she had brought with her, her grandfather's, was gone. Only one thing remained untouched: the offering plate, still resting on the windowsill, as if deliberately spared. Naomi didn't sleep. She sat in her rental car just outside Mount Mercy's gates as the sky turned gray and the dew clung to her windshield. Her grandfather's offering plate sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in a towel. The real one, the damaged one, the one Reverend Leon Tully must have quietly replaced, hoping no one would notice. But she noticed. And she had questions. Not just about the plate, about what he had seen, what he had done, and what he was still hiding inside the walls of that church. Naomi backed out of the room and drove straight to the police station, heart hammering, sweat cold on her back. She found Detective Miller and told her everything. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You said nothing else was taken." "Only the Bible," Naomi said. "That's what they wanted. The rest, they made a mess, but they didn't take it." Miller nodded slowly. "Because they knew what they were looking for." "They?" The detective hesitated. "Then, I'm going to show you something." She led Naomi down a back hallway at the station and into a records room filled with dusty filing cabinets. From one drawer, she pulled a sealed evidence folder and laid it flat on the table. Inside, a copy of a 1975 anonymous complaint filed by a congregant, a woman, unnamed, alleging inappropriate spiritual correction of minors by unnamed elders at Mount Mercy Baptist Church. The file was marked unsubstantiated, Miller said. The local pastor, Reverend Stovall, called it a misunderstanding. No further investigation was done. "And you think my grandfather was trying to speak up about the same thing?" "I think he was going to expose something the entire town wanted to forget." Miller placed the folder back in the drawer. "And now someone's trying to keep it buried again." That night, Naomi didn't return to the motel. She stayed at a nearby inn on the outskirts of town, under a different name. The clerk didn't recognize her. That was what she wanted. She sat up in bed, watching the shadows on the wall, turning over every detail. The room, the journal, the ledger, the theft, the offering plate untouched. And then it hit her. The second offering plate, the one she had found under the church, wasn't the same as the one on the altar. They were similar, but not identical. Her grandfather's had a notch in the rim, a crack. She remembered it from childhood. A story he used to tell about how it had slipped during communion one summer and chipped on the floor. The one now sitting on the altar was pristine, which meant... She sat up. Someone had swapped it, which meant someone had been inside the church recently, someone who had access, someone who remembered that detail. Naomi pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photo she'd taken of the 1975 Easter Bulletin. One name stood out, Reverend Leon Tully, then listed as Youth Ministry Assistant. Now the current head pastor. He'd been there all along, and he was still in the building. Naomi didn't sleep. She sat in her rental car just outside Mount Mercy's gates as the sky turned gray and the dew clung to her windshield. Her grandfather's offering plate sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in a towel. The real one. The damaged one. The one Reverend Leon Tully must have quietly replaced, hoping no one would notice. But she noticed, and she had questions. Not just about the plate, about what he had seen, what he had done, and what he was still hiding inside the walls of that church. By mid-morning, Detective Miller returned to the church with a full forensic team. Crime scene tape was drawn across the front doors. Photographers snapped angles of the hidden chamber. Evidence technicians cataloged every inch of the baptismal pit and the secret prayer room. Naomi stood back, arms folded, watching as the past was pulled up piece by piece. Then came the floorboards. "We're going to check under the sanctuary itself," Miller said, "especially near the altar and choir loft. You said your grandfather's last note said, 'You'll find me beneath their voices.'" "Exactly," Naomi said. "I didn't understand it at first, but the choir used to stand above the storage crawl space at the rear of the sanctuary. The acoustics came straight down. That's where they sang from." A team member, a young forensic tech named Andrea, disappeared beneath the rear section of the sanctuary with a headlamp, gloves, and a hand trowel. Less than 10 minutes later, her muffled voice echoed from below. "Detective, I think we've got something." Naomi crouched beside the crawl space hatch as Miller ducked inside. They moved carefully under the beams, dust thick in the air. Andrea's flashlight shone on a patch of disturbed earth beneath a warped joist. The dirt packed tighter than the surrounding area. She'd uncovered fragments of bone. Detective Miller nodded grimly. "Section it off. We'll take soil samples and begin excavation." "Human?" Naomi asked, already knowing. Andrea held up a partial jawbone with 2 molars intact. "Adult, possibly male. Based on size, yes." The entire room fell quiet. And then Naomi saw it, half buried in the soil near the remains. A metal nameplate, aged and corroded, but just legible. "I, Bell." Her legs gave out. She sat back against the wood beam and stared at the plate like it might speak. They had buried him here. Under the choir, under the floorboards where the voices rose every Sunday. Hidden beneath the sound of forgiveness, his body silenced while his name rotted. Miller placed a gloved hand on Naomi's shoulder. "We'll confirm everything through DNA," she said gently. "But this looks like it." Naomi didn't answer. She didn't need to. 2 hours later, the bones were carefully removed and taken to the lab. And as they loaded the final bags into the coroner's van, another officer approached with a small discovery. 2 books, dirt-caked and wrapped in rotting cloth, found near the remains. Both had been intentionally water-damaged, as if someone had tried to destroy them. But Naomi recognized them instantly. Her grandfather's 1977 sermon notebook, and his personal diary. At the station, she watched as forensic archivists gently pried the pages apart with tweezers and humidity chambers. The sermon notes were barely legible, but certain entries survived. One caught Miller's attention. April 3rd, 1977. Sermon planned. "Woe to those who shepherd in secret, but bury their truth in the pews." And the diary, though soaked and mold-stained, still held ink on several pages. One entry read, "They promised me the truth would die with a hymn, that they could outsing justice, but the truth does not sleep under organs. The truth wakes, and when it wakes, it will not whisper." Naomi felt something shift in her chest. A release. This wasn't just an exoneration, it was a resurrection. That evening, as she prepared to leave the station, Detective Miller pulled her aside. "We've interviewed Pastor Tully," she said. "He denies everything. Claims the journal and bones were planted. Says your grandfather fled town and this is all some theatrical hoax." Naomi laughed once, short, bitter. "Of course he does. But we got a warrant to search the current parsonage," Miller continued. "Inside, we found a locked fireproof box in the basement furnace room." She handed Naomi a printed photo. Inside the box were dozens of old offering envelopes, uncashed donation checks from the 70s and 80s, and a worn cassette tape labeled Session 6 Deliverance. "We're reviewing the audio now," Miller said. "But from the short sample I heard, it's not a prayer meeting. It's something else. Something rehearsed, coerced. There's crying, voices. Naomi looked away. She didn't need to hear it to know. That tape, she said, is your second offering. Miller frowned. What do you mean? The first was my grandfather's life. She turned, gripping the sermon notebook to her chest. This was the second. Naomi sat at the far end of the interrogation room, her grandfather's sermon notebook on the table in front of her. Its pages had been dried and preserved as best as the forensic team could manage. Most were illegible, blurred ink, rotted paper, mildew burns. But a few had survived. And what remained told the truth better than any confession. Across the glass, she could see Pastor Leon Tooley, seated, arms folded, jaw set in the kind of stiff, defensive silence that didn't come from ignorance, but guilt. He wasn't speaking to anyone, not the officers, not the detective. He'd requested a lawyer within 15 minutes of being read his rights. Still, Naomi watched him. She wasn't after answers anymore. She was after acknowledgement. Detective Miller returned to the observation room with a solemn look and a fresh file. He's not budging, she said. Still claims he had no idea about any secret room, no knowledge of the diary or the bones, says the offering plate was swapped years ago by a former custodian. Naomi didn't blink. He was there, in 1975, the youth ministry assistant. Too young to be in charge, Miller said. Too old to not know. She opened the file and handed Naomi a transcript. We dug deeper, pulled the personnel files from the denomination archives, took some digging, they weren't digitized. But we found something. She pointed to a line dated April 16th, 1975, just 3 days after Isaiah Bell vanished. Effective immediately. Elders Lot, Black, and Crane are hereby granted leave of absence due to personal reasons. Leon Tully to assume temporary interim responsibilities. Naomi's mouth went dry. He was promoted after my grandfather vanished. Miller nodded. Less than 72 hours later. And the elders? All 3 are dead, the detective said. But we've started reaching out to extended family, looking for wills, letters, anything that might corroborate what your grandfather wrote. In the meantime, she slid a second transcript across the table. A partial confession from a man named Rufus Crane, Joseph Crane's nephew. Says he remembers his uncle and 2 other men coming home one night drunk and shaken. Said they talked about a deacon who had to be handled. Naomi leaned forward. They silenced him to protect the money? Miller exhaled. They buried him to protect the lie. Your grandfather was never the thief. He was the threat. Later that afternoon, Naomi returned to the church, now locked down and cordoned off with state-issued crime scene tape. But the back lot was still open, and she walked the perimeter alone, boots crunching in the gravel, wind tugging at her sleeves. In her hands, she held the cassette tape the forensic techs had transferred to digital. She hadn't listened to it yet. She wasn't sure she wanted to. Still, she pressed play on her phone. The recording hissed to life. Then a voice, firm, low, unmistakably male. We're gathered here to cast out deception. Speak, child, speak your truth. Confess before God. A girl's voice followed, trembling, hesitant. I didn't do anything, I swear. I didn't want to go there with him, I didn't. The male voice cut in again, harder. You must confess. You must be clean before the Lord. You are responsible for tempting the man of God. Do you understand? A sob, muffled, then silence. Naomi stopped the recording. She had heard enough. It wasn't just spiritual abuse. It was emotional coercion, psychological torture, dressed up in scripture, performed in the dark. And her grandfather had tried to drag it into the light. That evening, Detective Miller called again. They've identified the remains. Dental and DNA. A match to your grandfather. Naomi closed her eyes. He can finally rest, Miller added. We'll prepare a formal release of the remains. You have full rights to arrange the burial. Thank you. There's something else. Miller said. She hesitated, then continued. One of the preservation specialists found a hidden note sewn into the lining of your grandfather's personal Bible, the one that was stolen from your motel room. We recovered it. No, Miller said, but we recovered the second Bible, the one found inside the sealed chamber. A spare. What did it say? She read from the note card. If I don't make it to the pulpit, tell my daughter this. I didn't leave her. I didn't walk out. I was taken, but I never stopped watching from the place where the voices ended. Let the next voice be hers. Naomi felt the wind knocked from her lungs. That was for her mother, and now it was for her. The funeral took place 2 weeks later. Dozens came, even those who had once whispered about the missing deacon, even those who once believed he was a thief. Naomi delivered the eulogy herself. She didn't talk about the bones, or the ledger, or the secret room. She talked about courage, about integrity, about a man who tried to speak the truth when it cost him everything. At the end, she placed the real offering plate on the closed casket. No coins inside, just her grandfather's sermon notebook, open to the last legible passage. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who hunger for righteousness, for they shall be filled. The demolition was canceled. Naomi stood in the center of the sanctuary weeks later, the crime scene tape long gone, the police investigation officially closed. A layer of dust still coated the pews. The air carried that familiar, mildewed quiet. But something was different now. It wasn't silence born from fear. It was stillness born from reckoning. The congregation was gone. The leadership disbanded. But the truth remained, buried no longer. And Naomi had made her decision. She wasn't going to tear the church down. She was going to transform it. Mount Mercy Baptist Church would not reopen as a place of worship, not in the traditional sense. Naomi partnered with a local justice initiative and began the work of converting it into something new, a memorial and community archive dedicated to exposing institutional abuse hidden behind spiritual authority. She stripped the sanctuary bare, removing every pew, every dusty hymnal, every false panel that had once hidden lies. In their place, she installed light. Track lights now shone where the choir once stood, illuminating plaques bearing the names of victims who had come forward after the truth broke. Not just from Mount Mercy, but from other congregations across the state. People who had stayed quiet for decades, now emboldened to speak. She rebuilt the altar, not as a pulpit, but as a display case. Inside, her grandfather's offering plate. The recovered 1977 sermon notebook, a digital recording station that played excerpts from Isaiah Bell's journal, narrated in Naomi's voice. The original Easter Sunday bulletin with his name beside the men who betrayed him. On the back wall, beneath restored stained glass, a line had been carved into the wood. Truth does not rot, it waits. One morning, just before the dedication ceremony, Naomi returned to the building alone. She walked the newly polished floors. The scent of old wood still lingered, but now it mixed with paint, light varnish, and blooming lilies placed in vases where pews used to be. At the center of the altar, she knelt and opened her grandfather's notebook one more time. There was a final page she hadn't noticed before. It had been pressed flat behind the back cover, brittle and faded, but still intact. In his handwriting, "They may bury the man, but they cannot bury the word." Naomi smiled. Later that afternoon, the building filled with quiet footsteps and low murmurs as the restoration dedication began. Geneva Thompson arrived in a wheelchair, flanked by 2 of her great-granddaughters. Naomi helped her to the front, where she gazed up at the exhibit with glassy eyes. "He'd be proud of you," Geneva whispered. Naomi didn't answer with words. She simply reached out and took her hand. As the event drew to a close, Naomi took the small stage at the front and addressed the crowd. She didn't speak as a builder or a bell. She spoke as a witness. To anyone who's ever been silenced by a place that was supposed to protect them, she said, this space is for you. To anyone who was told faith meant obedience without question, this space is for you. And to anyone still searching for the truth, I can tell you, it's not gone. It's waiting. She paused. It always has been. The audience stood in a moment of quiet acknowledgement. Not applause, not celebration, just recognition. And that was enough. That evening, Naomi returned home and opened the mail she'd let pile up for weeks. Near the bottom of the stack, an envelope caught her eye. No return address, postmarked from out of state. Inside was a photograph, a black and white image of her grandfather as a young man, standing outside Mount Mercy, arm draped over the shoulder of a small boy. On the back, in faded pen, for Naomi, some things can't be destroyed. Some things live in the light. She didn't recognize the handwriting, but somehow she knew exactly what it meant. The bell hadn't rung in 50 years. It hung above the church in the small steeple tower, rusted to near silence, its rope frayed and stiff with time. After her grandfather's disappearance, it was never used again, as if the congregation agreed, silently, that joy no longer belonged here. But Naomi had it restored, not replaced, restored. Same bell, same iron, same sound. The rope was new. The rust had been cleaned with care, and the clapper inside was re-welded by hand. Every strike tested until the tone returned to what it once was, deep, solemn, and reverent. On the morning of the public unveiling, she stood at the base of the bell tower alone. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light through the fog that lingered around the church like a benediction. She closed her eyes and pulled the rope. The bell rang out across Mount Mercy, not as a call to service, not as a signal of mourning, but as a proclamation that the silence was over, that the voice once buried had risen. Inside, sunlight spilled across the polished floorboards and rested on the altar display. Visitors arrived slowly, a few at first, then more. Survivors, advocates, local clergy, reporters, descendants of people Naomi didn't know, some with questions, some with flowers, all of them looking for something they'd lost long ago: faith, justice, truth, memory. She greeted them one by one. Some asked about her grandfather, others just stood in front of the offering plate and stared, like it was a relic, a symbol of something once trusted and betrayed, now held to account. A local pastor she didn't recognize stepped beside her quietly. "You think the church can ever be clean again?" he asked. Naomi didn't look at him. She was watching a child, no older than 10, tracing a finger along her grandfather's notebook beneath the glass. She answered softly, "No, not by pretending it never happened." She turned, "But maybe by telling the truth, loudly." That evening, Naomi returned to the sanctuary alone once more. She stood beneath the bell tower, dusk settling in streaks across the stained glass windows, the day now quiet. Not like before. This was peace, not fear. She sat in the front pew and reached into her bag, pulling out a single, folded page. The final sermon Isaiah had planned to deliver on Easter Sunday, 1975. She had pieced it together from scraps, diary margins, and sermon outlines. She unfolded it now and read the title, "When the Offering Costs You Everything," based on 2 Samuel 24:24. "I will not offer to the Lord that which costs me nothing." She smiled, then stood, walked slowly to the altar, and placed the page inside the offering plate. A gift, a return, not of money, but of the voice that had once been silenced. Outside, the church bell remained still, silhouetted against the fading sky, a silent monument to what had been hidden and what had finally come to light. and beneath it, carved in brass on the stone below, Deacon Isaiah Bell, 1925 to 1975. He did not run. He stood.